Donald Trump drops a shocking question that changes this Air Force officer's life forever. Have you ever felt like you weren't good enough? Have you ever spent your whole life proving yourself, only to reach a moment when you suddenly ask, am I living for myself, or am I just chasing someone else's shadow? Imagine being born into a family where your father is a war hero. The entire nation honors him. People speak his name with admiration, and his legacy is etched into history as a symbol of courage. But where does that leave you? You grow up with an emptiness that no medal on a shelf and no folded flag in a drawer can ever fill. No one understands this feeling better than Ava Sinclair. Since childhood, she has heard endless stories about her father, Captain Robert Sinclair, a legendary U.S. Air Force pilot who gave his life on a classified mission when Ava was just a little girl. She doesn't remember his face beyond old photographs, nor does she recognize his voice outside of a few grainy recordings, yet she spent her entire childhood chasing his shadow, clinging to one belief: if I become an extraordinary pilot like my father, maybe, just maybe, I will feel like he's still here. And she did it. Ava became one of the most outstanding young officers in the U.S. Air Force. Yet, despite all her accomplishments, there was always something missing. The truth was, she never really knew who her father was. Then, one day, everything changed with an unexpected invitation from the White House. President Donald Trump personally invited her to attend a special ceremony honoring the nation's most exceptional young officers. It was an honor any soldier would dream of, but Ava had no idea that this meeting would change her life forever. Just before the event, a White House staff member approached her and whispered that the president would like to see her privately before the ceremony. Ava froze. A private meeting with the President of the United States? Her heart pounded as she stepped into the Oval Office, but the moment the conversation began, Donald Trump asked her a question that left her speechless. Ava, are you truly living for yourself, or are you just trying to become someone else? That question echoed in her mind over and over again. Before she could answer, something even more unexpected happened. An elderly woman, her posture proud but her eyes filled with emotion, entered the room. She took a deep breath and spoke. I've waited a long time for this moment. I have something that belongs to your father. Something he left behind for you before he was gone forever. With trembling hands, she pulled out an old, weathered envelope, its ink faded with time. A letter from the father Ava never got to meet. A letter that could change everything. But what was written inside that letter? What secrets were hidden in those faded lines of ink? And, most importantly, was this the moment Ava Sinclair would finally stop chasing her father's shadow and start discovering who she truly was? Stay with this story until the end, because maybe, just maybe, you'll find a part of yourself in Ava's journey. On the outside, Ava Sinclair was the perfect image of a rising young officer in the United States Air Force, strong, disciplined, and always at the top of her class. But inside, she carried an emptiness that no medal or achievement could fill. From the moment she could understand words, Ava had lived under the towering legacy of her father, Captain Robert Sinclair. He wasn't just a skilled pilot, he was a legend. People spoke his name with reverence, and his fellow soldiers told tales of his extraordinary bravery. The nation honored him as a hero, but to Ava, he was none of those things. To her, he was just a name, a portrait on the wall, a folded flag tucked away in a drawer, one she never had the courage to unfold. She had no real memories of him, only stories from her mother and fragmented recollections from those who had served by his side. Deep down, she always wondered what kind of man he was. Did he love me? If he were alive today, would he be proud of me? The only answer she ever received was the weight of everyone else's expectations. People always said, "Ava will carry on her father's legacy. No doubt about it, she was born to be a pilot, just like her father." Captain Robert Sinclair would be so proud to see his daughter follow in his footsteps. She grew up believing that she had no choice, that she had to become a great pilot not because it was her dream, but because it was her duty. Because if she failed, she wouldn't just be failing herself. She would be tarnishing his name, and if she wasn't good enough, then maybe, just maybe, his sacrifice would have been for nothing. For years, Ava pushed herself past every limit. She volunteered for the hardest missions, worked twice as hard, trained until her muscles ached, and held herself to an impossible standard. No matter how much she achieved, there was always a voice inside her that whispered, "Not enough, keep going." But there was something Ava never told anyone. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, and asked herself, "Am I doing this for him, or just to prove something to myself?" More than once, she felt like she didn't truly belong. She loved the sky, yes, but did she love it the way her father did? She remembered a moment from years ago back at the military academy. That day, she had just completed one of the toughest training exercises. Her body was exhausted, yet her posture remained firm. A senior officer approached her, placed a hand on her shoulder, and smiled. "You're Captain Sinclair's daughter, aren't you? He must be so proud of you." She smiled back, but inside, she felt nothing. Because how could she know if it was true? How could she ever be sure if her father was truly watching over her, or if she was just chasing a ghost? She smiled, but inside she felt empty. Was he really proud of her? How could she know? How could she be sure he even saw her? Or was she simply carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations? Each day, Ava pushed herself to fulfill her duty. She never allowed herself to question or appear weak. If there was one lesson the military had drilled into her, it was this: never let anyone see you falter. And yet, even after becoming one of the most outstanding young officers in the Air Force, a deep uncertainty lingered in her heart. Am I truly honoring my father's legacy, or am I just chasing a ghost? Then, one fateful morning, she received a call from her commanding officer. "Lieutenant Sinclair, you've been selected to attend a special event at the White House. President Donald Trump will personally recognize the most outstanding young officers. Prepare yourself." Ava froze. An invitation to the White House? A ceremony to honor the best officers in the country? She should have felt proud, but instead an odd sensation crept up inside her. "Me?" she wondered. Am I chosen because of my achievements, or simply because I'm the daughter of a legend? These questions swirled in her mind as she arrived in Washington, D.C. Stepping out of a military vehicle, she looked up at the White House, its grandeur towering before her. She had no idea that this trip would change everything. That morning, Ava Sinclair woke earlier than usual. Stepping out of her barracks, she inhaled deeply, letting the crisp morning air fill her lungs. In the distance, fighter jets roared to life, their engines humming a familiar tune, one she had known since childhood. She was preparing for another day of training when a voice called from behind her. "Lieutenant Sinclair!" She turned to see a senior officer approaching, holding a white envelope in his hand. Instinctively, Ava snapped to attention and saluted. "Sinclair, I have important news for you," he said as he handed her the envelope, his expression serious. Ava took it, her heart pounding as she noticed the official White House seal stamped across the front. Slowly, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Her eyes scanned the words carefully. President Donald J. Trump cordially invites Lieutenant Ava Sinclair to attend a special ceremony at the White House honoring the nation's most outstanding young officers. This event will recognize individuals with exceptional achievements in the United States Armed Forces. We look forward to welcoming you to this distinguished occasion. She read it again and again, not quite believing what she had just seen. A ceremony at the White House, and she was one of the chosen officers. The senior officer in front of her smiled. "Congratulations, Sinclair. This is a great honor. You will represent the young officers of the United States Air Force. The President wants to meet you." Ava froze. The President wanted to meet her. Her throat went dry, and her mind spun with countless thoughts. Should she feel proud? Maybe, but deep inside she couldn't ignore the nagging doubt creeping in. Do I truly deserve this invitation? She hesitated before speaking. "I'm not sure why I was chosen, sir," she admitted, her voice uncertain. The officer studied her for a long moment before answering. "Sinclair, you are one of the finest officers I've ever seen. Yes, you carry your father's name, but everything you've accomplished, that's yours. Never forget that." Ava nodded, but the doubt still lingered beneath the surface. A few days later, she sat in the back of a black SUV, watching the streets of Washington, D.C. blur past. The White House loomed ahead, its grand, imposing presence almost surreal. This wasn't her first time in the nation's capital, but this time everything felt different. As the vehicle came to a stop at the entrance gate, Ava took a deep breath and stepped out. She adjusted her uniform, ensuring every detail was perfect, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she refused to let anyone think she was only here because of her last name. A White House staff member approached her, offering a polite but professional smile. "Welcome to the White House, Lieutenant Sinclair. The President is expecting you." Ava frowned slightly. "I thought the ceremony hadn't started yet." The staff member nodded. "That's correct, but before the event, the President would like to meet with you privately." Her heart beat quickly as she headed toward a private meeting with the President of the United States. She had no idea what awaited her, but one thing was certain: this conversation would change everything. Walking down the long corridors of the White House, Ava's polished boots struck the marble floor with steady, deliberate steps. On either side, portraits of past presidents lined the walls, leaders who had shaped the course of the nation. Ahead of her, a staff member led the way, stopping in front of a grand wooden door. "The Oval Office is just beyond it. The President is expecting you inside, Lieutenant Sinclair," the staff member said, his voice calm yet respectful. Ava took a deep breath, straightened her uniform to perfection, and nodded. The doors swung open, revealing the Oval Office stretched before her, grand, imposing, and filled with an air of authority. The long drapes swayed slightly in the afternoon light. At the center of the room, behind the historic Resolute desk, sat President Donald Trump, his eyes focused on a file in front of him. As Ava stepped forward, he lifted his gaze. "Lieutenant Ava Sinclair," he said, a slight smile forming on his face. "Thank you for coming today." Ava immediately snapped to attention, raising her hand in a crisp salute. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. President." Trump nodded and gestured for her to relax. "Please have a seat." She lowered herself into the chair opposite him, keeping her breathing steady. Never in her life had she imagined herself sitting in this room, face to face with the President of the United States. Trump flipped through a few pages of the file on his desk, then looked at her with sharp, assessing eyes. "I've read your file, Ava. Your record is impressive. Top of your class in training, highest marks in evaluations, one of the most promising young officers in the Air Force." Ava nodded but remained silent. Trump leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. I have a question for you, Sinclair. One that I'm sure you've heard many times before, but today I want you to answer it with absolute honesty. Ava tightened her grip on her hands, resting on her lap. Yes, sir? Trump paused for a moment, then locked eyes with her. Why did you join the Air Force? It was a simple question, but it struck Ava like a storm. She had heard it countless times before, in interviews, in conversations with fellow officers, even in quiet moments of self-reflection, and her answer had always been the same: because I want to serve my country. But today, sitting across from the President of the United States, she knew she couldn't give a rehearsed response. She took a deep breath, lifted her head, and spoke. My father, sir, Captain Robert Sinclair. Trump nodded as if he had expected that answer. He was a hero, Ava? She swallowed hard. Yes, sir. I grew up hearing stories about my father. People told me about his bravery, about how he sacrificed himself for his team. From a young age, I knew I had to follow in his footsteps. I had to become someone he would be proud of. Trump remained silent for a few seconds, then leaned forward slightly. Sinclair, let me ask you something. Are you sure you joined the Air Force because of your father? Or is it because you're afraid that if you didn't, you would disappoint him? The question struck Ava like a lightning bolt to the chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she truly thought about it. Do I love flying? Yes. But is it my dream, or is it just a way to keep my father close? Do I want to serve my country? Of course. But would I have chosen this path if my father weren't Robert Sinclair? She looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing against her. I don't know, sir. Trump nodded slowly. Good, because that means you're being honest with yourself. Ava lifted her head, surprised. Trump leaned in further, his voice steady and firm. Sinclair, I've met a lot of exceptional servicemen and women, but I've also met plenty of people who spend their entire lives chasing someone else's shadow. They believe they have to become someone else to be worthy. But the truth is, a real leader doesn't try to fill someone else's shoes. They carve out their own path. Something inside Ava tightened. She didn't know why, but those words hit her harder than she expected. I don't doubt your abilities, but you need to ask yourself one thing. Are you fighting for your own purpose, or just trying to prove that you deserve the name Sinclair? Ava felt her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know how to answer. Trump stood up, walked over to the window, and gazed out at the garden below. I want you to think about this, Sinclair. Not just today, but for the rest of your career. If you continue down this path, make sure you're doing it for yourself, not for anyone else. Ava took a deep breath, trying to organize the chaos in her mind. She had spent her whole life trying to become someone her father would be proud of, but she had never asked herself, am I proud of myself? Trump turned back to her, a small, knowing smile on his face. All right, Sinclair, I don't want to weigh you down with too many thoughts right before the ceremony, but remember what I said. Ava stood up, straightened her posture, and saluted. Thank you, Mr. President. Trump nodded. I'll see you at the ceremony, but first, there's someone who wants to meet you. Ava frowned slightly. Someone wants to meet me? Trump gestured toward the door. You'll find out soon enough. A strange feeling tightened in Ava's chest. Who could possibly want to see her today of all days? She had no idea that this meeting would change the way she saw her father and herself. As Ava Sinclair stepped out of the Oval Office, her mind was still racing with President Trump's words. The conversation had struck a nerve deep within her, one she had never dared to confront before. Had she joined the Air Force for herself or for her father? She took a deep breath, trying to push the thought away, but before she could fully compose herself, a White House staff member approached her. "Lieutenant Sinclair, please come with me. There's someone who wishes to meet you." "Who?" The staff member didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply said, "You'll see when you meet her." A mix of curiosity and unease stirred inside Ava. Who could possibly want to meet her today? She followed the staff member through the long, historic hallways of the White House. Portraits of past presidents lined the walls, watching her as she walked. Finally, they stopped in front of a small door at the far end of the corridor. Who was waiting behind it, and what were they about to reveal? The staff member knocked lightly on the door before pushing it open. Inside, an elderly woman sat gracefully in an armchair near the window. She wore a deep navy blue military uniform, old yet meticulously kept. Her frame was slender, but her eyes were sharp and filled with the kind of wisdom that only comes from surviving years of turmoil. She looked directly at Ava, her gaze piercing as if she could see straight into her soul. "Lieutenant Sinclair," she said, her voice steady and composed. "I've waited a long time to meet you, Ava." Instinctively, Ava straightened her posture, military discipline kicking in, as she saluted. "It's an honor to meet you, ma'am." The woman offered a small, knowing smile. "Langford. Beatrice Langford. But you may call me Beatrice." Something about the name made Ava pause. It sounded familiar, yet she couldn't quite place where she had heard it before. Beatrice continued, her voice calm but deliberate. "I served in the Navy. I was a squadron commander, and over 30 years ago, I met your father." A chill ran down Ava's spine. You knew my father?" Beatrice nodded slowly. "I didn't just know him. Your father saved my life." The room suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls had closed in around them. Ava's hands clenched at her sides. She had heard countless stories about her father, about his bravery, about his sacrifice, but never from someone who had actually stood beside him in battle. Beatrice's gaze drifted, her expression growing distant, as if she were being pulled back into the past. "We were part of a classified operation at the time. I was leading a squadron on a high-risk mission deep in enemy airspace. Our cover was blown, and my aircraft took heavy fire from the ground. The engines failed, and I lost control. My entire squadron was trapped, with no way out." She paused, a flicker of emotion crossing her face. "I thought that was the end for me, but then, out of nowhere, a pilot appeared. A man I had never met before. He flew straight into the chaos, right into the thick of enemy fire to protect us. Because of him, my team had a chance to escape." Beatrice turned back to Ava, her eyes locking onto hers. "That pilot was Captain Robert Sinclair." The room swayed. Or maybe it was just Ava. She had always known her father was a hero, but she had never known exactly what he had done to earn that title. Her voice came out in barely more than a whisper. "My father saved you?" Beatrice nodded. "But he didn't leave. As I made it out, I turned back and saw him still there, covering for the others. We begged him to retreat, but he refused. He said, 'If I'm not here, they won't make it home.'" She paused, as if trying to steady herself against the weight of those words. "It was the last time I saw your father." The room felt heavier, as if the very air had thickened. Ava felt a sharp ache in her chest. All her life, she had tried to picture what kind of man her father had been. She knew he was brave, but hearing it firsthand from someone who had fought beside him, who had been saved by him, made his sacrifice feel more real than ever before. Slowly, Beatrice reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. "Before that mission, your father gave me something. He told me that if anything happened to him, I had to make sure it reached his daughter." She extended her hand, revealing an old envelope. Its edges were worn, the paper bowed with time. Ava's breath caught in her throat. "Is this—" Beatrice nodded. "A letter your father wrote for you before he left on his final mission." A shiver ran down Ava's spine. For years she had searched for a piece of her father. Something beyond the stories and the medals, something that felt personal. And now, right in front of her, were his own words, waiting to be read. But did she have the courage to open it? Her fingers trembled as she reached for the envelope. She had no idea that the words inside would change everything about her father and about herself. The sounds of panic and happiness reached Eli Ayesue with laughter. Ava's hands shook as she took the letter from Beatrice Langford. The paper was fragile with age, yet the folds remained crisp, as if it had been carefully preserved all these years. She swallowed hard and looked up at the woman before her. "Did my father really write this for me?" Beatrice nodded slowly. "Yes. Before he left for his final mission, he gave it to me. He told me that if he didn't make it back, I had to make sure that one day his daughter would receive it." Ava stared at the envelope in her hands, her breath growing heavier. She had spent her entire life searching for a piece of her father, trying to understand who he was, and now, standing on the precipice of finally hearing his own words, she felt something she hadn't expected. "Do I truly want to know the truth?" Beatrice seemed to sense her hesitation. "There's nothing to be afraid of, Ava. Your father didn't write this letter to hurt you. He wrote it because he loved you." Ava tightened her grip on the envelope, took a deep, steadying breath, and slowly peeled it open. The ink had faded over time, but the handwriting remained bold and strong, just like the man who had written it. She began to read. "My dearest daughter, if you are reading this letter, it means I didn't make it home. I've thought long and hard about whether or not to write this, because the last thing I ever wanted was to leave you with pain. But there is one thing I know for certain. If one day you find yourself reading these words, I want you to know that I have always loved you, even if I couldn't be there to tell you myself." Tears welled in Ava's eyes. She blinked rapidly, forcing herself to keep reading. "I don't know what kind of person you will become. I don't know if you will love the skies as I did, or if you will choose another path. But whatever you do, I need you to remember this. You don't have to be a reflection of me. You don't have to carry the weight of my legacy. You only need to be yourself." A sharp ache clenched her chest. All her life she had believed she had to follow in her father's footsteps, that she had to become a warrior like him to prove herself worthy of the Sinclair name. But now, in my own words, he was telling you that you didn't have to. Her fingers curled around the edges of the letter as she continued. "Life will test you, Ava. There will be days when you feel like you're not strong enough, not good enough. There will be moments when you want to give up. But my daughter, never let fear decide your fate. Stand tall, even when you feel like you're falling. And if one day you ever feel lost, just look up at the sky, because no matter where I am, I will always be watching over you." Ava lowered the letter, tears streaming freely down her face. She could hardly believe what she had just read. She had spent her entire life trying to prove she was worthy of her father, but in the end, he had never needed that. He had never wanted her to become a version of him. He had only ever wanted her to live her own life. Beatrice watched her quietly, then spoke in a voice that was steady yet filled with deep understanding. "When your father gave me this letter, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't worried about his own fate. The only thing he feared was that his daughter would grow up believing she had to become someone she never needed to be. Ava lifted her gaze, her eyes still shimmering with tears. "How long have you kept this letter?" Beatrice sighed, a shadow of regret passing through her expression. "Over 30 years. I tried to find your mother and you after I returned, but the war was still ongoing. Then life pulled me in different directions. By the time I finally tracked you down, you had already joined the Air Force. I thought maybe it was too late." She paused, locking eyes with Ava. "But when I heard you were being honored at the White House, I knew it was time to fulfill my promise." Ava stood still, absorbing the weight of those words. For so many years she had wrestled with one haunting question. What would her father think if he saw her today? And now she finally had the answer. He had believed in her, not just now, but long before she was even old enough to question herself. She looked down at the letter once more and took a deep, steadying breath. "Thank you, Beatrice, not just for this letter, but for keeping your promise to my father." Beatrice smiled, her expression softening. "Your father was a great man, but I believe so are you, Ava." Ava let out a small, bittersweet smile, yet deep inside, she still felt an emptiness. She had spent her entire life chasing the shadow of a man she never got to know, and now she realized that the only thing he ever wanted was for you to find yourself. But how did she do that? She didn't have the answer. Not yet. But one thing she knew for sure, from this moment on, she would no longer see her father as a distant legend. She would see him as a father who had loved his daughter unconditionally. And perhaps, for the first time in her life, Ava Sinclair finally understood him. The room fell into complete silence, so still that Ava could hear her own breathing. She still held the letter tightly, her fingers gripping its edges as if loosening her hold even slightly might make it disappear. Beatrice Langford remained seated, her gaze fixed on Ava with patience and understanding. "You don't have to rush, Ava," she said gently. "But I know you can't wait any longer." Ava took a deep breath and carefully unfolded the letter once again. The paper had yellowed with age, but the words remained clear. Her father's handwriting was bold and firm, yet there was a gentleness in every stroke of the pen. She swallowed hard and began to read once more. "My dearest daughter, if you're reading this letter, it means I couldn't make it back. I'm sorry. This was never what I wanted, but when I chose this path, I always knew there might come a day when I had to say goodbye without ever getting to hold you one last time. I wish I could have watched you grow up, heard your laughter, taught you how to ride a bike, or seen you on your first day of school. I wish I could have been there to pick you up when you fell, to hold your hand when you were scared, to tell you that no matter what, no matter where I am, you will always be the greatest thing that ever happened to me." Tears slipped down Ava's cheeks. She had dreamed of those moments more times than she could count. She had imagined a childhood where her father had been there for her, but all she had were old photographs and stories told by others. She took a trembling breath and continued. "I don't know who you'll grow up to be. I don't know if you'll love flying the way I did or if you'll choose a different path. But Ava, my sweet girl, what I need you to understand is this. You don't have to live in my shadow. I don't want you to become a pilot just because I was one. I don't want you to carry the weight of my legacy on your shoulders. I just want you to be free." Ava felt as if someone had gripped her chest and squeezed it tight. All her life she had tried to become the person she thought her father wanted her to be. She had pushed herself to the brink, sacrificed her own dreams, and lived in constant fear that if she wasn't strong enough or good enough, she would disappoint him. But now, in this moment, she realized she had been wrong. Her voice came out in barely more than a whisper as she read on. Life will test you, Ava. There will be days when you feel like you're not good enough, not strong enough. There will be moments when you want to give up. But my daughter, never let fear decide your fate. Stand tall, even when you feel like you're falling apart. Keep moving forward even when the road gets tough, and most importantly, never let anyone tell you that you are not worthy of what you want. And if one day you ever feel lost, look up at the sky, because no matter where I am always watching over you. I love you, Ava. More than anything in this world. Live a happy life. That is all I ever wanted for you. With all my love, your father, Robert Sinclair. Ava let the letter slip from her trembling hands. She didn't try to hold back anymore. Tears streamed down her face, but this time they weren't just tears of sorrow. Beatrice watched her with gentle eyes. Your father has always loved you, Ava, and he never wanted you to carry the burden of his legacy. Ava nodded, but she couldn't find the words to speak. She felt as if something deep inside her had been set free. She had spent her entire life trying to become someone she thought her father wanted her to be, but in the end, all he ever wanted was for you to find yourself. A quiet moment passed between them, then Beatrice spoke softly. There is one more thing your father left for you. Ava looked up, her eyes still glistening with tears. Beatrice reached into her bag and pulled out a small metal box, which she placed in Ava's hands. Ava hesitated for a moment, then carefully opened it. The moment she saw what was inside, her breath caught in her throat. It was an old pilot's insignia, worn and faded with time. On the back, a small inscription was engraved for Ava. If you wish to fly, fly your own way. A fresh wave of emotion crashed over her. She clutched the insignia to her chest, her tears falling freely. For years she had spent her whole life searching for her father, and now she realized he had never left. He had always been here, always been watching over her. And finally, for the first time in her life, Ava Sinclair felt light. She no longer needed to prove anything. She didn't need to become her father. She only needed to be Ava Sinclair. And that was enough. Ava Sinclair sat in the quiet room of the White House, her father's letter resting on her lap and the old insignia cradled in her palm. She turned it over between her fingers, feeling the ridges and curves worn smooth by time. She had spent her entire life believing she had to live up to the name Sinclair, but now she realized her father never wanted her to carry that weight. He only wanted her to be free. That thought sent Ava into a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. If her father never expected her to become a pilot just because he was one, then what did everything she had worked for mean? The grueling years of training, the injuries, the moments when she pushed herself to the very edge of physical and mental endurance, had it all been a misunderstanding? Did she truly want this life? Or had she been chasing a shadow all along? A part of her wanted to push the doubts aside, to keep doing what she had always done. Stay strong, stay unwavering, never question, never hesitate. But for the first time, she allowed herself to ask, if I don't continue down this path, then who am I? Beatrice smiled gently. That's a question only you can answer. Silence filled the room as Ava could feel every beat of her heart. She had spent her entire life becoming a warrior, walking a path she believed her father had paved for her. But now she realized she had a choice. She didn't have to become her father. She could become Ava Sinclair on her own terms. A wave of relief washed over her, but with it came a quiet, unfamiliar fear. For the first time, she didn't have a predetermined path to follow. She had to carve her own. Ava turned back to Beatrice, and in her eyes, something had changed. Thank you, Beatrice, not just for this letter, but for helping me understand the most important thing of all. Beatrice nodded, her smile full of warmth. I didn't do anything, Ava. You found the answer yourself. Ava squeezed the old pilot insignia once more before carefully tucking it into her pocket. I think it's time I decide my own path, she thought. And with that, Ava Sinclair stepped out of the room, carrying with her a heart lighter than it had ever been. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she was ready to find out for herself. Ava Sinclair walked out of the room where Beatrice Langford had handed her the letter from her father, her mind still spinning from the flood of emotions. She had just lived through one of the most important days of her life, meeting the president, receiving her father's letter, and for the first time truly questioning her path. But the biggest question still remained. Where would she go from here? Ava stepped out of the White House grounds, feeling the crisp evening air brush against her skin. Her father's letter and the old pilot's insignia rested safely in her pocket, a reminder that he was always with her, and instead of feeling like a burden, they had become a source of strength. Returning to the Air Force Base, Ava felt something had shifted within her. The pressure to prove herself was gone, and the weight of living in the shadow of a legend had lifted. She walked toward the training area, where a group of young cadets gathered on the runway, some inspecting their gear, others preparing for a training flight. A young man, his flight suit still crisp and new, stood quietly beside a jet, his face tense with uncertainty. Ava recognized him. Ethan, one of the new recruits. She approached him slowly. You doing okay, Ethan? The young man startled slightly before snapping to attention. Lieutenant Sinclair, I was just thinking, he stammered. Ava studied him, recognizing the doubt in his eyes. The same doubt she once had when she was drowning in the fear of not being enough. She smiled softly, then slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out the old pilot's insignia. Do you know whose this was? Ethan shook his head. It belonged to my father. He was a legendary pilot. But do you know what he wanted most? Ethan furrowed his brow, listening intently. Ava tightened her grip on the insignia, then placed it gently into his palm. He didn't want me to become his replica. He wanted me to find my own path, and I think that's exactly what you need to do too. Ethan hesitated, staring at the insignia before looking back up at her, his doubt giving way to determination. Lieutenant Sinclair, do you really think I can do this? Ava smiled and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. A letter from your father? Ava nodded, even though she knew her mom couldn't see her expression clearly. Yes, Mom. I read it. A long sigh came through the phone as her mother's voice wavered, as if she were holding back tears. Ava, your father loved you more than anything in this world. When he left, I was afraid you would never truly know that. But now you've heard it in his own words. Her mother's voice softened. I spent so many years not understanding that. A gentle, knowing laugh filled the line, a laugh filled with love and memories. It doesn't matter. When you realize it, sweetheart, what matters is that you do. Ava tightened her grip around the old pilot badge in her hand, her voice stronger now. I don't want to live in Dad's shadow anymore, Mom. I want to live my own life. Her mother took a slow, deep breath before responding. Then do it, Ava, but remember, you don't have to do it alone. Those words stopped Ava in her tracks. She had spent her entire life trying to prove herself, trying to be strong, trying to never need anyone. But now she understood she didn't have to carry everything on her own. I still have you, Mom. I still have people who love me. I was never truly alone. A soft smile touched Ava's lips. Thank you, Mom, for always being there, even when I didn't realize it. Her mother chuckled gently, her voice warm with love. "I always will be, Ava, just like your father." Ava lifted her gaze to the night sky through the window. Stars shimmered against the darkness as if someone were watching over her. She didn't need to search for her father anymore. He had always been here, right in the sky and, most of all, within her own heart. A sound of footsteps approached from behind, pulling her back to the present. She turned to see Captain Anderson, her first flight instructor in the Air Force, walking toward her. "Sinclair," he said, his voice no longer that of a commanding officer but of someone who had watched her grow. "We're flying a special mission today, and I want you to lead it." Her eyebrows lifted slightly at the mention of a special mission. Captain Anderson gave a slow, solemn nod to honor those who had flown before them. A wave of emotion tightened in Ava's chest, but this time it wasn't pain, it was pride. She climbed into the cockpit of her jet, the familiar controls fitting perfectly beneath her hands. As the engines roared to life, she took a deep breath, eyes locked on the horizon. This time, she wasn't flying to prove anything. She was flying because she was meant to, because it was her choice. And that made all the difference. The takeoff signal echoed through her headset. Ava pushed the throttle forward, feeling the powerful thrust propel her toward the horizon. The jet surged upward, cutting through layers of clouds, climbing higher and higher. She glanced down. The airbase below shrank until it disappeared, leaving nothing but her and the endless sky. She exhaled, letting herself fully embrace the moment, and then, almost instinctively, she whispered, "Dad, I know you're here." Just then, a gust of wind swept past the aircraft, as if answering her. Ava smiled softly. For the first time, she no longer needed to search for her father in the distance, because he had always been right here, right in the path she had chosen for herself. And this time, she wasn't flying to prove anything. She was flying for herself. Ava Sinclair's story is more than just the journey of a young female pilot. It is a journey of self-discovery. She spent her whole life chasing a legacy, trying to prove that she was worthy of the name Sinclair. But in the end, she realized that true worth is not defined by who we come from, but by who we choose to become. We all have moments of doubt, questioning whether we are good enough, strong enough, or worthy enough. But the real question is not whether we meet someone else's expectations, it's whether we have the courage to walk our own path. Have you ever felt pressured to live up to someone else's expectations? Have you ever questioned the path you're on? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can continue bringing more meaningful stories to life. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. May you always be strong, always believe in yourself, and if you ever feel lost, just look up at the sky. See you in the next story.